Hi, I'm Malicious. Welcome back to my channel where we do a lot of MMORPG stuff and also general gaming. Today I'll have an in-depth analysis on Guild Wars 2 in 2021, including all the major aspects, so this video will appeal to beginners and long-time returners to the game, and should highlight what the game is like to play at the year of 2021. That being said, the video will be divided into chapters, so I won't force you to watch all of it. If you are more interested in the PvP section, for example, just jump over there and vice versa. We'll be looking at PvP, World vs. World, PvE, and many more aspects of the game as a whole package, ending with some of my opinions. Now, this video has taken literally an age to make and was a longer project than expected, so any feedback, likes, comments, subs, or anything are highly appreciated. But thank you for joining me, and let's get stuck in. So I think a great place to start is pricing and account types. So there's an expansion in the game, but there's also the ability to try out a lot of the game for free. You get the entire base game for free with some restrictions that are mostly there to stop gold sellers, not very harsh at all, and you can play the game for a long time before you even consider upgrading to an actual account. On screen you should be able to see some of the comparison tables and what account type allows you to do what, not to mention that the standard just buying the game and all of its current DLC being Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire will only take you about £26 if you live in the UK. And what better time for this, especially since there's a new DLC coming sometime in the near future. So now if you're considering actually playing the game, let's talk about the races and classes briefly and what you have access to, as well as a brief talking about specializations. For the races you have the Char, the Humans, the Norn, Asuran, and Sylvari, all of which have these little details about them to immerse you in the world, as well as different appearances and styles that you can mess with. Character creation screen is nothing super amazing, for example like Black Desert Online, but it does give you options to diversify your chosen characters. It's also worth mentioning that every race has its own cool starting area with different introductions to the game, including how you're introduced into the world, the quest lines you follow, the path you travel, and your own cool dialogue and cutscenes specific to your race and options, which should be visible on screen right now in little snippets. Also, a cool thing about Guild Wars 2's character creation is depending on your race, class, and general stuff, it lets you choose from a bunch of options on screen that change and shape the way your character is played. It's worth mentioning that this is only generally a smaller portion of the game and doesn't really go super far in, but it's something for new players that they don't often see, or choices they don't often get in a lot of other MMORPGs. So although this only influences your personal story, it can be things from the gods you are blessed by, your general demeanor when conversation options are allowed, so brute force versus charm and vice versa. It was enjoyable at the time it came out, and is still an interesting system to look at. Let's briefly go over the classes. I won't explain how all of them work, but I'll give you examples of the sheer amount of depth and variety available within the game. Guild Wars 2 was always marketed as a game that doesn't have a set tank or a set healer, so it took up a niche sort of spot back then. Currently, every class in the game has their own self-heal skill, and almost all classes are able to run a tanky style, supportive, full glass cannon, or something of that sort, so there are multiple ways to play a singular class. The current available classes in the game are Warrior, Guardian, Revenant, Ranger, Thief, Engineer, Necromancer, Elementalist, and Mesmer. If you have the core game, you will have access to all of these classes, even in the free-to-play version, apart from the Revenant, which is the only class that comes from one of the expansions. Now let's briefly go over the playstyle options for these classes. Now let me elaborate a little more with a demonstration. If we disregard gear and weapons for a second and just look at skill trees and abilities, each class has unique traits and attributes. For example, I'm on a thief right now. I have an array of specializations to choose from: deadly arts, acrobatics, trickery, critical strikes, shadow arts, and the last two elite specializations that change your playstyle a bit and give you special abilities, Daredevil and Deadeye, both of which actually unlock weapons, so you can become a ranged thief with a rifle, or a Daredevil staff-wielding thief. Although it unlocks these options, they are not necessary to play Daredevil or Deadeye, for example. So the game lets you combine these specs and pick attributes with them to alter your abilities, or add skills, or mess with your playstyle just the way you like it. Basically, you have a lot of options, and I could easily make an hour-plus video explaining these to you on how many options you have on each class, but know that technically you can play a totally different style of thief. You have multiple heals to choose from to do different things. You have 3 utility skill slots and an elite skill slot that changes your playstyle even more, and this once again does not include weapon skills, which are on the screen from 1 to 5 on the bar at the bottom. Every class is unique in its own way, and although meta is still a thing in the game and sometimes hinders creativity, there are often new builds or more effective builds that assist you in the world of Tyria. It's a very extensive system for sure and has a lot of depth. You should be able to see on screen that I am messing with some of the specs and adding a 3rd dodge to Thief, for example. The universal thing between these classes, however, is that they all have 2 dodges, which can be increased or decreased, but we'll get further into that in the combat portion of the video. This applies to all the classes once again. If you are more interested in knowing about these systems, leave me a comment and I can work on it in a huge video, but it will be a lot of information. So now that you have a brief understanding of what being a class entails and how it can vary from being a sharpshooter, long-ranged sniper, assassin thief, all the way to an up-close and personal with a dagger thief, or anything really, it's time we talk about the combat system itself. Guild Wars 2's main combat appeal comes from having a lot of depth and options, combined with the specs we talked about and how they alter abilities, utility skills, elites, and such. Every class has the dodge function, which functions as a iframe that recharges. Thieves can make those 2 dodges become 3, for example, and use certain skills to gain endurance needed to dodge even more. And for example, mesmers can give up a dodge to gain other things. The other huge part of the game is weapon swapping. You can have 2 sets of weapons equipped and swap between them during combat. For example, as a close-up thief, I can have a dagger and a pistol for damage, then switch to a short bow for some AoE damage and mobility in PvP. You can change these out of combat, however during combat there is a small cooldown between swapping sets, which brings us nicely to the skill bar. So in this game there are 2-handed weapons and 1-handed weapons. Your weapon skills are 1 to 5 by default. More often than not, your 1 ability is a chain auto attack ability that goes up to usually 3 hits with different bonuses or debuffs respectively and increasing damage. If you are dual wielding weapons, for example, the first 3 skills are usually tied to your main hand weapon and the last 2 are tied to the offhand weapon. But if it's a 2-handed weapon, all 5 skills belong to the 2-handed weapon. However, sometimes on certain classes, for example Thief, the 3rd skill is tied to a combination attack of both the main hand and offhand weapon. So it can be weird, but it adds depth. There are 19 weapons in Guild Wars 2 in total, and for example Warrior, which is strictly a class that avoids traditional uses of magic, can use 11 of them, 13 including aquatic weapons, which results in 19 different weapon set combinations for just that class. If that isn't variety and depth, then I don't know what is. Now that you have a brief understanding of how it would feel like and the depth involved in playing a class, let's talk about the combat system as a whole. Now, while Guild Wars 2 is still a tap target game, it probably has one of the best tap target systems available on the market today, at least in my opinion. On top of that, there is an addition of the action camera mode as well that works really well and sort of mimics the whole action combat sort of style. So bear that in mind as we speak about the combat system in general. It's not true action combat, but it combines things like line of sight, cleave, AoE damage, single target, range projectile abilities that can be dodged, blocked, and so many other different little systems, including the ability to shoot in or use a leap finisher on other skills to create effects, whether that's an AoE stealth by blasting a bomb into a smoke field that stacks up, or your arrows going through a wall of fire placed by somebody else and the fire damage being added to the end of it and setting the enemy on fire. It's a cool, extensive system with lots and lots of depth. There are of course buffs and debuffs in the game, but the two main damage types of the game are condition damage, which is basically fire, poison and stuff like that usually ticks over time, and direct damage, which is your standard burst damage that can critically strike. You can enhance all your criticals and enhance your condition damage with your skills, abilities and specializations, as well as gear, which has its own set of stats, but that's a whole nother video in itself and cannot be explained as briefly. Now, as I said, dodging is a part of the game and is basically an iframe, but it won't exactly remove conditions that are placed on you unless you have some sort of traits. It's one of the most important abilities in the game to avoid damage, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are still crowd controls, boons, debuffs, cleansing, and all manner of effects and abilities that really shine when used correctly. And this doesn't include, for example, rangers micromanaging pets and pet skills. There's also interruptions, especially for those healing abilities in PvP, for example. And of course, there are combos plus the down system, which basically allows you to die and be able to be revived by other players or by killing what is killing you. So, being revived by other players during a world boss is quite common, but in PvP, you want to be revived or another player will use their finisher ability to get rid of you and you will be forced to respawn. There's so many little nuances and changes in the game that many people completely glance over when considering or discussing the game, so I wanted to include them to show you guys who have not played the game before that the system isn't as simple as it seems at the beginning, or at least on the surface. Another thing Guild Wars really does well is underwater combat. Although underwater combat and exploring are somewhat rare encounters compared to on land, the extra depth helps. There are 3 underwater weapons: harpoon gun, spear and trident. There's a variety here in underwater pets and other things too, and great attention to detail in general that just adds more flavor to the game. Also, I should mention that class matters regardless of the weapon you choose. For example, here's a small showcase of the Ranger Greatsword skills from 1 to 5. And here is a Warrior's Greatsword skills using the exact same weapon. Ignore the damage difference. I was using a condition build on my Ranger, so the power damage of the Greatsword isn't exactly accurate to what it would normally pull off, which is usually quite insane damage when built right. But you can see that it's not like ESO to the point where, oh, these abilities are kind of the same. They're very much different. Now, there are no pros without cons, so let's talk about those. While the combat system is great, especially with the action camera and the sheer amount of depth and variety available, this does make balancing harder, which usually means that there are meta builds that are eventually just better in every way of doing certain things, even if it's not your personal preferred playstyle. Now, that doesn't mean that the PvE meta build is the same as the PvP one, but it does mean certain builds and weapon types will stand out more than others unless the weaker ones get buffed or the stronger ones get nerfed. Now, at least in the structured PvP area, oftentimes builds stay up there for months, but it doesn't stop you from exploring, trying new things, or finding out an even better build that does suit your playstyle, as well as how much impact you can actually make with just your knowledge and mechanical skills. This can be overlooked a lot unless you want to min-max to the maximum. However, this doesn't stop you from doing normal content or personal story or exploring and should be taken with a grain of salt. It's only a warning to the most min-maxed people out there to say that, hey, in certain areas you might need to run a meta build, or you might be expected to run a meta build for certain things just to get the maximum out of what you're doing. Also, the combat system has a few issues of its own. Unlike certain games that utilize camera shake or big meaty blows that feel impactful and super effective, the art style and the general style of combat often doesn't make all your attacks feel as impactful or satisfying as they are, but only a small complaint really. This doesn't apply to all abilities. Some do feel like they have weight, others just don't feel strong at all, even though they give insane numbers based off of their animation and just what actually happens. Also, a small complaint of mine: when I first played Guild Wars 2, I managed to find myself completing the base game and spending most of my time in world versus world or player versus player games. Because once I had gotten the gear, I wanted, that was all really. The game has changed since then. You do still have to get gear with different pieces and different sets. However, it's not a huge gear grind like games like Black Desert Online. Once you've gotten the gear, there isn't much to do apart from getting different sets or condition builds, and it doesn't necessarily take too much to get there. But we're only talking about the gear, not the amount of content, but from a gear grind perspective. This can be considered a double-edged sword, however, since Guild Wars 2 is very much a casual-friendly game. So you can have multiple alts with the best gear for your chosen spec and playstyle, which make the game both casual and alt-friendly for those of you that don't mind that. For those of you that will stick to one character, however, and gain everything possible you can on that one main, you will still have thousands of hours of content to go through, but you may get bored eventually. I'm also not mentioning legendaries in this gear portion, but we will be discussing them shortly, and these are only a few things to bear in mind. Alright, let's briefly mention legendaries here. Legendaries are one thing you really need to grind for in the game, whether it's the achievements needed for them and the content associated with them, or grinding the money to outright buy them entirely. Legendaries in this game are one thing I cannot fault. They do feel legendary, they have special animations, completely changing the look of the weapon. Honestly, some of the most beautiful legendaries I've seen in any game. They require a lot to get there, which gives them that legendary status, and they have small perks like having the ability to switch the stats on it. For example, weapons can have power or precision or any combination of certain stats. On a legendary, you don't have to conform to getting multiple weapons like a condition damage weapon or the power damage weapon. You can just switch the stats on that weapon as required. There's legendaries that are pretty much every type of weapon in the game, some more than others, and they are on screen right now. Honestly, beautiful. Also, they change the way you walk in some of them. They leave little footprints or add some of their essence, and it's genuinely just great, including legendaries that shoot rainbow unicorns. The effects go from wacky and beautiful to downright badass based on the weapon, including sound effects, attack animations, and more stuff. Not just what you see on screen. So, let's talk about the story and the lore finally in the world of Tyria. There's actually quite a lot of story and lore found around every corner. The story is engaging and takes you around the world without spoiling anything. Some parts of the story are actually quite good and really engaging. It feels like you're playing a single player RPG a lot of the times, even though technically if you choose you can do much of the story with other players. Solo players will rejoice in the fact that they do not need other players to adventure the world with and go through in the game. And the best part is that you can do it all at your own pace. If you want to do a few story quests, then adventure, do some other activities, and find other cool places to explore and learn the lore about, you are more than welcome to. In fact, you're encouraged to. The game works in a way where you can get sections of the story almost like seasons, where the world feels living and breathing, cities change at times and are blown apart and rebuilt later, or a few other grand and interesting effects. I don't want to give away too much here, but there's a lot of story and it does involve you and make you feel like things are active, disasters are happening, threats to the world are real, and you're rewarded if you act. The whole living story system Guild Wars 2 definitely has its merits for sure and makes things interesting. Also, you did not need to know about Guild Wars 1 or have played it to be able to enjoy Guild Wars 2. There's a lot of references or throwbacks that reward nostalgic players of Guild Wars 1, but nothing necessary or insane. You're not missing an entire, portion of the game. You're missing a completely different game. I personally played and still miss the original Guild Wars. There's a lot of lore and art involving Guild Wars 2 and Guild Wars 1, including meaty books, believe it or not, that make things feel alive and less shallow as you do things. But once again, I don't want to spoil that, and I'll let you know that there's just a lot of lore to enjoy, a lot of story and general PvE gameplay, packed with stuff, interesting fights, adventures in the story. The footage is early story since I don't want to, spoil you guys and keep spoilers to an absolute minimum, but it gets better and wackier as things advance, and it might be your cup of tea or it might not be. The only way you'd be able to tell is by playing. Now let's talk about some of the leveling experience in Guild Wars 2. Firstly, obviously there are story quests that reward you, but that isn't the only way to level. Guild Wars 2 has thrown the traditional side quest formula in the trash and created its own unique leveling experience. You obviously gain experience from killing monsters, but that's not the main way to gain experience. You gain experience from map completion and doing activities and unique things on the map, including exploring. It's very possible to just run around the map unlocking teleport points or waypoints as they're called in Guild Wars 2, while just enjoying the scenery and gain a big chunk of experience. Points of interest also are unlockable little points. Vistas also give you experience, which is basically a mini jumping puzzle. You have to climb up and do a little jumping puzzle and you get a view at the end and a bunch of experience, as well as heart tasks on the map, which seem to have replaced the side quests as a whole and give you objectives to do, some involving killing, interacting with things, and much more. These side objectives give a lot of experience, and this once again is just the tip of the iceberg. Furthermore, there are dynamic events and dynamic event chains with little bits of lore and hidden stories, as well as world boss spawns. If you've ever played Final Fantasy XIV, they're basically a better version of Fates in my opinion, and they are quite fun to do while adventuring. The game basically gives you broad options to level, not just your main character but your alts as well. There's also more things to unlock and achieve further down the line, especially if you get the expansions. Also, another good thing to note is regardless if you're way too high level for an area, the game will scale you down, or in some instances scale you up to being a max level character, and you still gain experience. So you can still adventure with your friends or complete low level areas you've missed or anything you really want. The game doesn't really restrict you too hard. Now, Guild Wars 2 does a great job of letting you level and play your character however you wish, as we discussed. If you already have one level 80, for example, you gain a good chunk of experience also from crafting, by the way. So you could AFK craft on a alt and gain some levels for sure. Let's say that you're a PvP fanatic. Well, you can go to the structured PvP battleground system and just play against other players and mess with your builds in equalized battlegrounds and gain experience tomes and other rewards from PvP rewards track that also levels your character. Now, if you don't really want to do structured PvP, you can go to World vs. World and do the same thing to level, explore, just play the game. Although the game will scale you up to being a level 80 there, it isn't recommended to actually continuously fight other level 80s that aren't scaled up, since still you're at somewhat of a disadvantage. Rather, it's much simpler to follow a train or a Zerg, I guess, and gain experience rewards and stuff like that by playing as a unit together. And if that still isn't enough, you gain experience from some of the many dungeons available in Guild Wars 2, although that method is a little less common until you've reached a certain level on some classes to unlock those dungeons. So, whether you're a PvPer, a crafter, an explorer, an adventurer, solo player, lore fanatic, anything really, the game definitely accommodates many ways to advance your level. Now, the leveling experience in Guild Wars 2 definitely has depth and stands in its own realm when it comes to MMORPG leveling at the moment. It gets a huge plus from me simply because it's unique and doesn't feel like I'm grinding non-stop to gain levels, because everything I do in the game is basically giving me experience, whether it's optimal or not. So it lets you focus on the journey rather than the destination of certain things, and the whole side quests that require you to fetch items or any other boring obscure quests that we find in traditional MMORPGs of the game today are just non-existent in Guild Wars 2. I mean, there's still a few that seem boring or bland, for example, but the variety is large, so there's a lot of them that are a lot cooler than some of the other ones, and I think that's good. It's a unique system for sure, and it doesn't feel like a grind or a push. Best way I can explain it is it's like being distracted by something else while the game gives you experience, and you don't necessarily care about too much unless you need to reach a specific threshold. And as I said, dungeons, dynamic events that include people make the world feel alive, and people are running around everywhere, and it's genuinely a good experience for any solo and group players. So now's the perfect time to talk about the general PvE experience briefly. We already discussed and highlighted everything in the leveling section, and I'll briefly list the PvE methods of Guild Wars 2. So we talked about exploring, story, personal story, heart tasks, dynamic events. These are all something we discussed, as well as dungeons. Now, there's quite a few other dungeons in the game. Now, if we talk about the general run-of-the-mill dungeon content, In a game where there's no conventional healer or conventional tank class, where everybody has their own self-heal, it can be interesting since it's more about doing the mechanics correctly. So if the mechanics suck, then the dungeons automatically fail. However, Fractals of the Mist, for example, is also a form of mini-dungeon mostly done around endgame, where you can push to higher levels of difficulty. I can't really compare them to Mythic Keystones from World of Warcraft, for example, but there is a whole set of mechanics to those two of their own. But I can say definitely that it is a whole different adventure in itself. These do require a bit of farming though, otherwise on the higher levels you instantly die from this debuff called Agony, so your gear needs agony resistance since these are 5-man dungeons. It's usually quite easy to get into them and just get through them effectively. Then of course there are raids, which in my opinion are good, but they definitely fall behind World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV raids, at least in my opinion. Not sure how they could be fixed or changed in a way to where they are better, but I think they're in a decent spot, at least from what I hear from people in general. So if you enjoy Guild Wars 2's dungeon and fractal system, the raids will probably be right up your alley. The gap, however, between open world PvE and raids is night and day when it comes to difficulty, but once again, it's all about the mechanics in raiding. But the raiding doesn't kick in unless you actually have at least one of the expansions. These are all some of the ways to get ascended gear for sure, and stockpile a bunch of other stuff that you might need in the future. Strike missions function as a different type of instance, by the way, and ease players into more difficult mechanics before they make it to raids. There's Dragon Response missions, which are instances that you can either do solo or in a group of 5. And of course, there is Gathering and Crafting, which count in their own system. Now, the instances are all generally cool, and there is a good selection of them. The raids do what they say on the tin, and generally there is a wide variety of things to experience, raid and instance-wise. Considering how large the game is in general, however, don't expect to see as many instances as World of Warcraft, for example, but there is a large amount to choose from. I've decided to keep raids, dragon, and strike mission footage out of the video because they could spoil certain things that others may not want spoiled, but if you're up to it, check out a few raid videos on YouTube or leave me a comment and I'll do something about it if you really want to see that kind of stuff. So we've covered a lot here, but next up is the world itself, the themes, art style, and general ways of exploration. Now if you're looking for a game that allows you to travel everywhere but at a slow pace, Guild Wars 2 is not that game. The world is definitely huge, by the way. However, there are so many waypoints that you can teleport to for a small fee of your in-game money, a few copper or a few silver for convenience, and I honestly think that that's fine. The world of Tyria is a vast and artistic place, and you can tell that Guild Wars 2 has its own unique style of things in general in the world and how mobs, people, and just everything in general looks. Other ways of travel and exploration come in when we talk about mounts. During the expansions, mounts were released, and without giving you too much spoilers, each mount has a unique thing that it does, and it plays into the general gameplay now. I'm not talking about mounted combat, for example, more about getting over certain obstacles or interesting ways of travel. For instance, a bunny can jump real high, like really high. You can reach some insane areas with that. And a raptor can leap over large gaps. And there's mechanics in those parts of the expansion where you will be using these tools to get over basically roadblocks and deal with the obstacles in the world in general, and it's a cool way of travel. Now that there's 8 unique kinds of mounts, all of which, by the way, have amazingly cool skins. I'll show off a few on screen currently, but I'll leave some of them as slight surprises for you to find and figure out for yourselves. When we talk about the art style of a huge world, all I can say is look at the screen. Honestly, the style of the world and the people, the design and the architecture will not be universally beautiful to everyone. I don't think it's bad personally, but some people think it's literally the best thing they've ever seen and absolutely love it, and some people absolutely despise every part of it. Now for that part you'll have to choose for yourself, but I can tell you as a fact that Guild Wars 2 has its own unique art style which either attracts or repels you. Things in some areas seem a little more cartoonish than one would expect, but the influence spreads everywhere, from the UI, the party system, the menus, all of that, skill icons, even the animals in the world have their own unique little Guild Wars 2 flavor added to them, and of course there's a lot of loading screen art that one considers beautiful in its own way. Now we've got exploration and general usefulness of the world. you are rewarded for exploring, and we've already discussed that. Besides the obvious via experience and items, there are indeed such things as jumping puzzles in the game as well. Many of them, in fact, that some people find frustrating as hell and other people just hunt them down and do them for fun. The game incorporates a little bit of lore, hidden story, riddles, events, jumping puzzles, cool mechanics that seem so simple on paper but are really effective. For instances, invisible walls, for example, in a puzzle in the dark, traps you need to avoid that will send you back to square one, Indiana Jones style boulders, and so on. There's a lot going on in this department too, and for the general health of the game, I think it works fantastically. Even though I personally despise jumping puzzles, I can see their value for the players that enjoy them, and of course I'm not obligated to do them unless I want something specific, for example. So if puzzles, jumping, and random fun mechanics, or unfun in my case, interest you, then you'll enjoy jumping puzzles and a lot of those little riddles and all the things that require problem solving in the game. So let's move to the PvP section of the game, starting with the lesser known World vs. World. So for all you PvPers, World vs. World is a game mode that puts you in one of several different maps. I think it's about 5 maps, and it's basically your server's World vs. World group versus others. Usually this is a combination of 2 servers which create the 3 world server teams. So a 6 server total split into 3, creating a bloodbath of a 1-on-1-on-1, the fatal 3-way. Now the premise is cool. You go around and PvP each other in a large open map, and there are many maps to choose from. The main goal is to capture and control as many parts of the map as possible. Castles, keeps, all of these, including siege tools like robots, catapults, and defense tools, and this is usually fun. You get a bunch of rewards, and it's accessible to players at a certain level threshold and boosts you up to level 80 automatically for the remainder of your time in that map. Although usually at a lower level you still won't have all the resources required to match most other max level and geared players, you won't exactly be chewed apart for existing either. As always, there's other things here too, like jumping puzzles, some random PvE mobs, special pets that you can only get here if you're a ranger, for example, small objectives to take out, as well as a few small things to gather just to add to the map and give it more depth and flavor, since the maps are different and get different kinds of terrain, scenery, and other stuff to mess with. Now, World vs. World used to be extremely fun back in the day when it was more prominent. There was a healthy amount of roaming and dueling, which involved one or a handful of players taking on other players, whether it was in an outnumbered fight. Either way, they were usually just small skirmishes for the sake of PvP fun. Now roaming is essentially quite dead. You can often count the amount of roaming players on one hand, and it's very unfortunate to see that the World v World meta currently revolves around zerging in groups. And the unfortunate truth is, on some if not most of the servers, there aren't many fights in general. It's more attacking and taking bases, keeps, and such other things in a very robotic way. You know, if the enemy side is weaker or asleep, you'll go into a smaller sized zerg, perhaps maybe 30 or 40 people slaughtering about 12, gaining experience from the captures and stuff, then going back to business as usual. It's unfortunate to see World v World in this state today, especially since it used to be one of my personal favorite ways of PvPing and just enjoying the game. I tried multiple times to get any kind of good fight, and it was just a colossal waste of time on my server. I've spoken to some NA friends of mine that also still play, and they echo the same on their end. The other form of PvP is more played and comes under structured PvP. It's very easy to get there. You just click a button and you're in a PvP lobby area where you can test stuff out and just walk around with other players and just mess about. Basically, this PvP mode is based entirely on being on equal footing. The game allows you to use whichever specializations you have available to make a build of your own, or copy any of the numerous meta builds online. Then you press a button, queue up, and go into a world of equalized team-based PvP. It's just that simple. This is the more played PvP part of the game. and it has its own ranked mode as well, tournaments, teams, and many other things. You don't even need to be max level to go into structured PvP, and could genuinely level a character from nothing to max level just by doing enough games and getting the tomes for, off the consistent war track. As I said, another way of random leveling by just doing what you want to do. It's not including the achievement rewards, by the way, or any other stuff you get from the PvP reward tracks. Regardless of what activities you really do in the game, it always throws out items or rewards at you, and this goes for PvP as well. Although it may not be the most efficient or fastest way to level, it still goes with Guild Wars 2's formula of allowing you to play the game however you really see fit. Of course, there are restrictions on things or requirements depending on what you need. For example, you can't really do the story from the PvP lobby, and you can't unlock what you need for that. So the main game mode in structured PvP is a game mode that has 3 points, A, B, and C, with a 5 versus 5, so 10 players on the map in total. The objectives of each game is to fight over these points and secure them for as long as possible till a single team reaches 500 points with a 15-minute time limit. There's 16 maps also to choose from. The average game length is about 10 to 12 minutes or so. As I said, 15 minutes is the maximum. And each of these 16 maps have their own mechanics and objectives to fight over. Anything from mobs that increase your points or buff your points, to capturing objectives that give bonuses in battle, or even auto-capturing all the points on the entire map over fighting over a specific map objective. Catapults raining hell, and many more things to choose from. It makes things interesting, and most games don't last super long, so it's very easy to hop in and get a few games going without much investment. As with any PvP system in any game, if you do ranked, it can be uncivil and heated, so I would advise not instantly jumping into ranked all the time. Also, it's worth mentioning that your PvP build is saved separately to your PvE build, so you can mess around with this stuff here to your heart's content and really experiment a lot before deciding which class suits you and what spec and so on. Just as any other aspect of Guild Wars 2, there are many reward tracks here and cool things to unlock, including unique and interesting finishers and a bunch more other things. Eventually, with certain currencies, you can unlock unique gear here, also unique fashion styles and many other things. Also in PvP, as I warned earlier in this video, this is one of the areas where meta does dictate rather strongly what performs the best, which can be limited to some players. It doesn't necessarily matter if all you want to do is a quick match or a few quick matches, or even get good on an off spec and do ranked. But if you're the min-maxing type, then you will most likely feel like you aren't performing to maximum efficiency, and that might bother you. Alternatively, there will be other players of similar mindsets, which will limit the variety of not only classes, but specs and builds that you will play against as well. You'll eventually be able to call out who's running what's with relative ease, and seeing something new and fresh will be few and far between. However, that is decided by the players who decide to run those builds or run something else, and by the balancing of PvP in general. So there will be times where the meta shifts and changes, and hopefully doesn't remain stale for too long. There's a lot to learn in PvP to be sure to be effective, and you can instantly have fun. However, just don't expect to make the best plays and maneuvers early on. In a game where there's so much depth and variety in builds and weapon choices and how one can be played, it seems like a shame that sometimes only one style of play is viable on certain characters, and in the past, entire classes have been non-viable unless in the hands of a veteran. We can hope those days never come again, and that variety and balancing changes and reworking things in general to where every class has more than a few playstyles to play in the future. Now let's answer a burning question that many people have in regards to pay to win. Now, Guild Wars 2 is one of the more affordable MMORPGs on the market, expansion included, since the base game is free to play, and without a subscription model, the game is not pay to win at all, to answer your question briefly. You can go through the entire game without spending much, but within the game you can turn gems into gold, or you can turn that gold that you make in-game into gems. But the marketplace, although it has some small boosters and helpful items that are convenient to playing the game, or even character slots, are not necessary at all and are achievable in-game, if you turn your gold into gems, of course. Almost everything else on the market is cosmetic, and the convenience items we just discussed don't necessarily matter when you can't exactly use that money to buy the best gear in the game. I suppose you can just put stupid amounts of money into the game and buy a legendary, but you would need to do that a lot. And if you really wanted to, that doesn't provide you with any huge benefits either, over having an ascended weapon rather than just the bragging rights of having the legendary cool weapons. So in my opinion, this game isn't pay to win at all. There's a lot of cosmetics, hairstyles, convenience items to go through, toys and skins, mounts, mini pets, rare weapon skins and outfits, but none of it is anything that will give anybody any level of dramatic progress over another. Everything you need is achievable in-game, and it's a fair model. You're never really forced to spend $1 for more content beyond the one-time purchase expansions. ArenaNet makes most of its money from people purchasing the expansions, but of course, many people will and do spend money on buying large amount of cosmetics available, and many people of the hardcore variety spend many hours farming in-game gold and turning it into gems instead of purchasing those items. So the options are open to you there. What says a healthy MMORPG more than the amount of people playing the game? So it's worth talking about the population of the game. So in this day and age, when people talk about MMORPGs, usually Guild Wars 2 is mentioned usually somewhere after World of Warcraft and somewhere before ESO. The game is very much alive. There are people everywhere, and Guild Wars has solidified itself as one of the top played MMORPGs in general. The game boasts over 14 million players in total, with the current activity being estimated at around 1 million players daily on average, and no less than a couple 100,000 concurrent players at any given time. The population is healthy, and with new content coming and eventually the new expansion, I can only estimate it will get healthier with returning players and new players, considering just how many thousands of hours of content there is likely within this game. And I don't think it will die anytime soon. Perhaps at times there may be dips and declines in population, but nothing game killing or unhealthy population wise. So this video was quite long, and with everything we've discussed, let's sum it up in a Guild Wars 2 analysis. Now the game is definitely one of the biggest MMORPGs available today. It's relatively cheap to get the content in its entirety. There's no need for a monthly subscription. Even free to play, you will have thousands of hours to go through. The population is alive and well. You've got aspects to mess with within the game: PvP, PvE, raiding, crafting, story, and lore. Everything you could really need, and it follows a Western MMORPG style as opposed to the endless gear grind that is found in more Korean-based MMORPGs. You can get your gear relatively quickly, and there's not much of a need to really upgrade much or spend countless hours working on that. With that said, Guild Wars 2 definitely appeals to and caters to a more casual player base with daily caps and challenges. The game will let you do pretty much anything your heart desires, but as a hardcore player, you'd have to find your niche. For me back then, it was World vs. World, but we've already discussed how World vs. World was neglected quite a lot and is a shell of its former glory. PvP is also an acceptable one, but how many times will you PvP and rank up before you really get bored? That one is a personal matter there. I know many are put off by the idea of permanently equalized gear, but if you're driven by personal skill progression, then PvP could definitely work for you. There is a little lack of variety there, as we discussed. There's meta, and meta is still meta, but you can always make your mark on the world of Tyria that way. By being off meta or being on meta, it's up to you. You can still make legendaries for sure, which are gonna take, a couple months to get stuff situated for, so there are milestones and achievements that you can get in the game. Guild Wars 2 has lasted a long time since its release. It's got 2 expansions and is getting a 3rd. It's the perfect MMORPG for anyone that wants to invest thousands of hours, and leaving the game doesn't really put you behind either. You can stop playing and come back at any time without much of a hit because your gear wouldn't have changed much at all. Sure, you may have missed some living story or some extra content or events, maybe even cosmetics, but you are still relatively continuous in the game. as not much of the gear or the level changes, nothing is pay to win at all as well in the game, and the combat system for a tap target game is one of the better ones out there with pure depth, fun and variety, but it won't appeal to everybody. My personal advice is to at least try the base game. It's pretty much free to play and go from there. You will have tons of content to do with that alone, without any need for any extra expansions, so you can just play the game, and if you really feel the need and you feel like, hey, I like this game, let me get the expansions, then it's there for you. It's not my favorite MMORPG, but I still have a respect for it for being different. Also, I was a Guild Wars 1 fan, so I'm a little biased there at least. I preferred Guild Wars 1 to Guild Wars 2, and the level of openness there was so much better. So, anyway, this video was an absolute mess to make. I did promise my content would get better and more in-depth with time. Sorry for the delay to anybody that was waiting for a new video. I'm a small channel, so any likes, subscribes, and comments are highly appreciated. I'm humbled to have 89 subscribers, so truly thank you for that. If you want to be kept up on more MMORPG and gaming news, reviews, gameplay, in-depth guides, anything to do with gaming in general, I would love it if you guys hit the subscribe button and the bell. I'd like to make my content better, and I need your help with that. So leave me a comment on what excites you or any feedback. My socials are in the description down below. If you want to come and hang out with me on Twitch or see some of my bad tweets or join the Discord community, I will be changing up some of those tweets to incorporate more news instead of just making videos on it. And as always, I've been Malicious, and this has been a pleasure.